Welcome to the Bring It On Home podcast. I'm Frankie V, former Sydney and London resident, now living in Nashville, Tennessee. This podcast features interviews with the various characters I come across in my travels through the music heartland of the American South. Alright, I'm with Jake La Botz. This is Frankie V, and it's a Sunday night in Nashville, Tennessee. Say hello, Jake.
Hi, people.
Excellent. All right. We'll do a special shout out to Michael, who was in our meditation group here in Nashville, who's now in Korea.
Mike Cannon in South Korea.
Yeah, we miss you, and so we'll dedicate this one to you. All right. I'll tell you a little bit about... This is how much I know about Jake La Botz, anyway. He's my meditation teacher here in Nashville, Tennessee, and... someone recommended I go see him at the 5 spot, and I was like, okay, who's this guy? And I looked him up, and all I saw was that he was a meditation teacher. And I think I went to the 5 spot, and I harassed him about Tibetan Buddhism, but it was really nice to talk to someone about Tibetan Buddhism that was also into music and stuff, which has kind of been my passion. And we will not talk about how music should... or how to come up with a Buddhist musical style, because we'll just get into a big black hole or rabbit hole like we did the first time. But you know what? I think what interests me is like Nashville. Like, how did you get to Nashville? What brought you to Nashville?
I was on tour with my girlfriend, Annika. I was playing at tattoo shops around the U.S.
All right.
And I had a gig in Murfreesboro on that tour. We didn't even stop in Nashville. I'd probably only been here 2 or 3 times before that. And we were thinking about moving. We lived in Brooklyn. She had her own apartment. I had a little room I lived in. And we couldn't afford to get an apartment together. And I've been making my living as a touring musician mostly. And I thought, like living in New York, if you're not making New York money, there's really no point in trying to live and survive in New York, because it's really hard to do unless you're making that New York money, making that money in town, or making it someplace where you can afford that life and that lifestyle and that rent. So we were scoping places out on the road, and somehow at the end of that tour, we just decided, you know what, let's go back and check out Nashville. It was like one of the few places we didn't really get to check out when we were on tour. And we came back here for 3 days, and somebody had jumped me into this Facebook group that had to do with living in East Nashville, and I put a post on there, am looking for house to rent with girlfriend, have good credit, no pets. Within moments, some guy had messaged me, who is now my landlord, incidentally, and said he has a place for us to check out, might work out. He wasn't sure he wanted to rent it. It was going to take some work. So we came here, we looked at this house, and immediately I said, yeah, we'll take the house. Like, it was just exactly where I wanted to live. It was in a nice, quiet neighborhood near the park. There's like songbirds singing everywhere. I mean, everything that could go right went right in those 3 days that we were here. Annika went out and had these really nice meetings with women who were doctors and therapists in women's sexual health and in fields that she was interested in studying. And now she's going to Vanderbilt, and she's in this master's in nursing program. So she wasn't sure that's where she was going yet, but it was sort of this general idea, and she was meeting people. And there was this Aikido dojo down the street. And I was sort of thinking I might get back into Aikido. And Annika really wanted to try Aikido. And it looked like a nice dojo. And so we went there. And those people seemed cool. And I got an acting agent. Acting was something I've also been doing over the years. And this guy was like, oh, yeah, we'd love to have you here at this agency. And we booked stuff for TV shows around the Southeast. So everything seemed to be going pretty good. And also, I was interested in teaching meditation in prisons, and there's a bunch of prisons around here.
Sure is.
Of course, there's a bunch of prisons around everywhere in America these days, and they seem to be popping up like McDonald's or something.
Mississippi. I mean, you do a tour of Mississippi and you see lots, a little town and then another prison, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's crazy how many prisons there are. So anyway, there's a couple of prisons here, and I thought, okay, well, this, that's something that I want to do. And then it's for touring. This is a natural place to be. The music thing was almost the last thing on my mind, actually, about living here. I thought, well, I know some musicians who live here, and that's a good thing. J.D. McPherson is here as a buddy, and there's some other people.
You're a Chicago guy originally, right? So
Originally from
to
Chicago.
give you some context, yeah.
Yeah, and this is a boom town, and a lot of people moving here, and people I know who are moving here. So there seemed like to be a lot of good reasons, but basically we jumped in kind of blindly. And a lot of the things that I thought I wanted to do here weren't really coming together, but some of the other things did.
And you've been here 3 years like me, so 2015, late 2015, 2016, or?
2016, we got here August 2016.
Okay, so a little less than me.
Just over 2 years.
Yeah, okay, yeah. I've done 3.
Yeah, and the prison stuff actually came together, and I started teaching at a prison here in Nashville, and then also teaching at a prison in Northwest Georgia, teaching meditation, and then also, teaching at the house. I started this little group, and we weren't sure how that was going to go. We invited people to come, and it sort of went through these different phases, and then finally we landed on this program of working with a book by Reggie Ray, The Awakening Body. Reggie's my teacher, and this book is like, it's like a really great kind of textbook in a way. It offers a lot of view and a lot of practices, and so that group has been another thing that has like really grounded me in this place and in living here and connecting with people. And I don't really do much playing around here. I mean, music is what I do for a living, but it's mostly happens on the road, I think, like a lot of musicians here.
Yeah, so Nashville's a bit more like, it's kind of cool living here as a punter. By that I mean like as a spectator, as opposed to being in the music business, because people like have concerts in order to work out their stuff. Like it's more like I don't know what you'd call that. I mean, I can't think of it, but like a convention for musicians to find session musicians or sidemen to work with and throw their ideas around, and so you get to see really cool people in really small venues playing for other musicians and stuff. So it's like a bit of a test market, really, rather than a necessarily market to break into.
It's also interesting that you're kind of just one of the guys. If you're a guitar player who plays for a living, you're really nothing special. But at the same time, nobody really thinks you're like an asshole because you play guitar, or that you don't have a real job, which in a lot of places,
that's a good point.
The way that people think about music and musicians and art in general, it's not a real job.
It's a really good point. And when I get down on Guitar Town, I just have to remember that actually guitar-led music is not the dominant paradigm in the rest of the world. And it's actually, when I was a promoter in London, it was easier to get money for DJs than it was for bands, So this is kind of a special thing and a kind of an outlier of a certain genre of music and stuff. So it's kind of special to be able to be here. In a way, preserve something, I don't know, probably the stuff we grew up with, which is guitar-driven music, right? So
I think it's a very special place. One thing that I think is special about it that I notice, and because the thing I relate with most, I suppose, on a daily basis is the nature here. Every day when I wake up, I hear the birds singing. And I've never lived in a place that had as many songbirds as I experienced in Nashville.
Very true, yeah.
I got here, it was in August a couple of years ago, and I was just amazed by the birds, so many birds, and singing all the time. And I thought, no wonder all these songwriters,
agree,
came here and wrote songs.
Yeah.
It's based in something about the nature, the geography, and other things.
I've never seen more beautiful birds than here. And then you kind of like, I can see how this inspired like a Hank Williams song or, yeah, that was one of the more honest realizations I had from living here. Like, we take out all the kind of hype and the drama and the, whatever pretense. That was just one of these genuine, oh, there's some really beautiful, like, birds here. And like you say, just, it's true. There's something about that, that backbone of country music. I could see that. I like that.
Yeah, and as a songwriter, I found it like to be that the inspiration for songwriting sort of feels like it's coming from a different place in a way. And I don't know if I can exactly put my finger on it, but I get to go out to this park every day and just go be with the animals and just listen to the birds and just kind of let my mind wander. And I suppose songwriters probably do that in a lot of different places.
Yep.
When I lived in LA, I would go to Griffith Park, and I've always found some way to go touch into nature. It's really different here. It feels more alive in a way.
Yeah, I get you. And it's funny because there are other parts of nature that are also problematic about being here. Like, we're in a bowl. We have a lot of problems with allergies, and that kind of affects things. So there's kind of like a positive and a negative. But yeah, for sure, there's something to this place for sure. And I like those genuine, objective experiences with a place, like you say. And I definitely feel that about Mississippi. But there's probably a lot you can talk about around Mississippi too. Like, so I don't know your back catalog of work so much. I know the last album, which I really like, and I delved in a little bit, some of the backlog, but I do know that you're into the blues, and I do know you're like, Delta bluesman, like, and I saw some of the influences of your bluesman. Again, people I hadn't had too much access to, but always wanted to ask about that stuff. But also Mississippi. Every time I tell you about, I jump in, and my experience in the Delta the last couple of years has been just kind of regenerative in that kind of natural way. And every time I want to talk to you about Mississippi, it almost feels like you're guarded because you've got more stories around it. I think you may have spent time there, toured there, whatever, like, and you've kind of explored something that in so much more detail than I could have. So I've always wanted to ask you about that.
Mississippi is an amazing place. I spend most of the time I spent in Mississippi was in the early to mid 90s, and I was still drinking then and using drugs. So a lot of it is kind of a blur. But there are these moments that were just so wild and so penetrating in a way. And there were people that I got to spend time with, really some great blues musicians that, a lot of that stuff doesn't really exist down there the way it used to exist, of course.
Hard to define, but there's more of it than you would expect at this time, but it's hard to define.
Well, I really appreciate what they've done in Clarksdale, that they found a way to make the town kind of viable in a way that maybe it wasn't back then. There wasn't much money coming through. There was a small amount of tourism. ZZ Top and some other people really helped out with the Delta Blues Museum, which originally was in the library. And when I first started going there was a guy named John Ruskey, and he was the curator of the museum in the library. Really cool dude. He's still there. He's got a canoe company called Quapaw Canoe.
Yep, I got the brochure over here because you told me about it. Now I've got in the back of my head, I've got to do that. So the next time I go down, I'm going to do this. But
yeah, he's amazing. He's the riverman. He gives these guided tours all over the U.S. on rivers. But he's also a blues musician. He was this guy who was playing with Super Chicken back then. I think he was playing accordion and keyboards with Super Chicken. The Oil Man, Big Jack Johnson, was around back then. There was a guy named Eddie Cusick who was around, not in Clarksdale. He was from, I think, maybe Greenville or something. There was Lonnie Pitchford, who was really an amazing guy. He was pretty young compared to the blues musicians that I was, hanging out with and checking out and seeing back then. But he was the musical grandchild of Robert Johnson. He had learned how to play guitar from Robert Jr. Lockwood, who was Robert Johnson's, stepson. And so he played note for note all of Robert Johnson's music. He was probably in his 40s when I knew him, in the early 90s. He was an incredible musician. He was famous for making little one-string Diddy bow guitars and playing those. And you can find footage of him from the 70s playing his Diddy bow. You can see on YouTube. And he also had a problem with crack cocaine. And that's partly where we joined ways, was that I was a heroin addict back in those days. And so, I think probably the last time I hung out with Lonnie Pitchford, he had played on this festival that Honeyboy was on, and I was hanging out with Honeyboy Edwards in those days. And me and Lonnie Pitchford staying in the same hotel. I forget, it's an old hotel. I think it's still there. Old funky place in Clarksdale, in the town there, on the riverfront, maybe riverfront.
Yeah,
hotel.
that's a famous one, I think. That's possibly one that was like a black-only place where a lot of the musicians would have stayed, and it has stories. Right. It doesn't look like, I think you can rent it, but it doesn't look particularly inviting at the minute.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's quite, I mean, was there a lot of drugs amongst blues players then? Was that a thing? I mean, I know historically it was a thing. Like, it always throws me that Ray Charles was like injecting. It just blows my mind a blind guy would be injecting drugs and managing all that shit. I don't know that I could. I don't know how Keith Richards stays alive, but I think Keith Richards could be a doctor. Like, how methodical he is with the way he approached his drug taking. Like, to have survived to now just blows my mind, when so many people dropped along. So anyway, a blind guy taking drugs, always like...
Yeah, I mean, I definitely smoked crack with some blues musicians. Okay. I think mostly I drank with, that was the common denominator, was alcohol most of the time. The very few older musician heroin addicts that I got high with were jazz guys.
Okay.
But in the blues world, yeah, I mean, it was cheap wine and gin and, whatever we
Moonshine,
could. Yeah. Maxwell Street Jimmy Davis, who was this great blues man that I got to hang out with in Chicago, and we played together a lot. We played on the streets, and we actually took him back to Clarksdale, took him home to play on the Sunflower River Blues Festival one year. But yeah, that guy would wake up and drink a half pint of gin in the morning, first thing, 6 a.m., 7 a.m., whenever he got up. That was his eye-opener. Hard to keep up with that guy, actually. And I was a drunk. Yeah, alcohol was a common denominator. But not everybody had a problem with booze, like Honeyboy liked to drink, and he liked to smoke weed. But it didn't seem to be an all-consuming thing at all with him, as it did with some other people.
I've seen some BBC documentaries on the blues and like blues in Britain, and them bringing these people over, and they maybe have a picture with them in the bottle, but then the people were telling the stories of how they would drink milk before they would drink the whiskey and stuff. So they were quite they were quite sensible about it. And I think the thing that I get from being in Mississippi is like how powerful the church was in helping people deal with the pain and suffering, which quite clearly there was a hell of a lot of, in that place because of its history. And I think that in some cases that really did save a lot of people, or that kind of stopped them from maybe going or crossing over. They felt some sort of obligation to their church. It's a strange place, the crossroads, because it's like the dark, magic side of things, and then there's like a pure Christianity, transcendental Christianity, and the two work against each other somehow.
Well, we pretend that there's, some division between those two things.
Right, that's true as well.
That's a made-up thing that we came up with, who knows, I don't know, 10,000 years ago, or maybe not that long ago. I don't know, but like certainly with Christianity, there's this big divide between good guy, bad guy. And probably in the indigenous African, traditions, they didn't have this kind of like weird modern division in that way.
Duality. Yeah, I agree. But I find it still quite. I find that you still hear them talking like the duality, like, did the blues come from the Reverend wanting more people in church and seeing an empty piano and asking the musicians from the juke joints to come into the church? Or did the church teach people to play music who then went on to playing the juke joints? It's like kind of the two versions of the history. Maybe there's a little bit of both, but whatever it is, there's some kind of, for me, like, I'll see a gospel singer one day, and the same day I'll see the person that came in from the juke joint or the hill country, and who talks about, like, sometimes needing help from certain, I don't know what he used. I love the way he described it, but, like, effectively the dark arts, or, some kind of, it's a strange, I love Buddhism because, for me too, I think the duality of belief doesn't help. And it puts two sides of yourself against each other, and it creates an inner conflict. And for me, it took, like, even though my parents were kind of they were quite liberal, as Catholics, Catholicism has a lot of mysticism too, but I had to, like, be a goth for like 5 or 6 years to, like, transcend this division, to embrace, for want of better terms, like, darker imagery, so that I didn't fear it. It became part of me, and then I let it go, and then I didn't have to have either imagery. And I'm like, I don't want that imagery. That just seems like dogma, and I'm not interested. So to me, I like the fact that Buddhism is just, it's not about that so much, but there's still different color to the whole.
Oh yeah, there's certainly things that we do that are harmful, mm-hmm. or dangerous or not helpful. Mm-hmm. And that's very real, and you can call that dark if you want to. Mm-hmm. There's something that's, that's going down a path that's based on ego manipulation, mm-hmm. and harming oneself, harming other people. Yep. And we recognize that in Buddhism too. Maybe not as much as a moral situation, mm-hmm. or that it's being driven by a Satan who lives in some place down below in a fire.
Or at the crossroads.
Well, even the crossroads things, it comes from African tradition,
mm-hmm.
And I don't think it has this connotation of, like, I don't know for sure. I'm not a historian or an expert on African indigenous tradition, but I kind of doubt that it has that sort of, like, selling your eternal soul vibe.
But I think that just objectively, the idea of coming to a crossroads in one's life, and you have to choose, and each option, you're weighing them up, and maybe that one road looks smoother, but doesn't take you where you want to go, and the other road is tougher.
I hear what you're saying now.
The imagery in itself is like, is there? I try not to put labels on it. Like, this is kind of the Buddha stuff. You just try and experience it and be with it and not fear it. I think as soon as you put labels on stuff, you fear it. And I think the people there that realize, if you're under that much pressure or stress, if you, like, say, reach out, if you do something bad in order to get money, or you take drugs in order to deal with a situation, it's very short term. But to really kind of go through and find the best place, it's more of a long-term solution, and you kind of have to constantly work at being a good person. And you know what I mean? It's really just that. I think there's an acknowledgement of that, and being in that part of the world, a lot of them had a really bad set of circumstances from which to start with. You know what I mean? Like slavery, and I guess then sharecropping, and talk about starting a life with a hand tied behind your back. You didn't have police presence. They left the people to their own devices, and there was a certain amount of, there was, like, a lot of murders and killings and blah, 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 and it was too much for the local police force that focused on the towns, and so it was kind of a dark place. You could die from the society killing you, or you could die from your own society, killing you, and it was just, I can't begin to imagine how someone might come out of that, and someone might come out of that very religious, or someone might come out of that, the world is a bad place, and I've got to take care of myself. So, and I'm not sure neither of us coming from, like, 20th century America can really comment on that, right? So.
The history of that place and the pain that happened in that place of slaves being taken to like this brutal rainforest full of snakes and insects, and like having to like chop all that down and then plow that land and turn it into land to grow cotton, and like all that history is so dark. It was so brutal. And one thing that comes through that pain, there's so many beautiful things that come, that people, even having gone through all of that, or as part of that, I don't really know how to say it, but there's so many gifts to the world that came through that, and like the whole world's been given this music, that so much of it is born out of African American people's pain.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right, I can't really comment on it. I'm not an African American
Mm-hmm.
person, but I certainly have to acknowledge that the total brutality and the amazing gifts that all of us were given from people who suffered through that stuff. It's amazing that like one of the biggest exports of this country has been its music.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, now it's we export all kinds of garbage, but one of the most beautiful ones, one of the
Mm-hmm.
most
Defining.
yeah, blues, gospel, jazz, rock and roll, soul music,
Mm-hmm.
and so much of it being born out of such a small area in the
Mhm.
country. It's pretty fascinating.
It is totally fascinating. So when you went down, you were obviously already studying with, I know when I read your bio, you studied with a bunch of these blues guys. What was that like? Like, was it, when you say study, did you take tuition, or did you? I'm always curious, like.
Oh, I didn't study with anybody. I mean, I just hung out with people. I hung out with. I was lucky to grow up in Chicago. I grew up in Chicago
At the right time, they're still alive.
at a time when I was really into music. I was kind of a sad kid, and I liked to listen to sad records by myself.
But were you sad as in literally sad, or were you sad?
Oh yeah, I was very, very.
Okay, because I listened to
pretty
Joy Division, and
miserable.
I found Joy Division like uplifting, and I saw that as transcendent. So that's why I asked.
Well, that's an interesting thing, though. You can be sad, and you can listen to sad music, and it can still open you up because there's a shared feeling.
Mm-hmm.
There's a feeling of I'm not alone in this.
Mm-hmm.
Actually,
Yeah,
I think
correct.
that's part of it.
Yeah.
And I definitely felt that when I discovered.
The blues.
One guy playing guitar by himself singing blues.
Mm-hmm.
I had probably seen people playing on Maxwell Street when I was a kid, playing blues here and there. It was something that was just in the background in Chicago. It was something that was part of the landscape, that, blues existed. And, like the Blues Brothers movie came out at some time in the 70s when I was probably 10 or 11, 12 years old, something
Okay.
like that. And it was centered in Chicago, and there's all these places I knew, in that movie, and musicians I knew about. Down the street from my house, there was a painting of Howlin' Wolf, and there was
Did
a
you grow
sign.
up on the south side?
No, I grew up on the north side of
Okay.
the city. There was a painting of Howlin' Wolf, and it said, every Tuesday night, Howlin' Wolf. And
Mm-hmm.
I was like, what is that? What is Howlin' Wolf?
Mm-hmm.
Those musicians from the south side and the west side of Chicago, from African American neighborhoods, also played in other neighborhoods of
Mhm.
Chicago, played on the north side. So it was kind of just floating around in the air, and I didn't discover it really in full until I was in my teens, probably about 15.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember hearing a Honeyboy Edwards song on some compilation I picked up from the library. I would go to the library. That's where I mostly discovered
Mhm.
music, because it was free and we were poor. And the only way I really got music was if I illegally, because it was illegal to tape record from the radio, but I'd like have a cassette
know,
tape on my
yeah.
boombox, like record
Yeah,
music
yeah.
on the radio.
But
and
as
then-
kids, I think we all. I find it funny when they talk about like being. I couldn't afford that many records. Like
Yeah.
Spotify now, $10 a month, and you're like got everything at your disposal.
Crazy, I know.
But then I couldn't afford records. You had to like really work it out. Like I love when they talk about the 50s and disposable income. Kids had disposable income to spend. I'm like, how many records could these people buy? But anyway, going back to like, you know.
Yeah, so I went to the library. I would listen. And I discovered people that were still alive. Honeyboy Edwards was playing down the street. Like I think I probably first went to see him when I was a teenager. I remember he had his thumb all bandaged up, and he said, "Wasn't enough meat on my table tonight. I had to cut into my thumb." And that was all he said. It was like a joke, but I don't think anybody really got it. And then he played, and he was amazing. Mm-hmm. And then I went back to Maxwell Street as a somewhat of an adult, late teens, early 20s, and I saw these guys that were still playing down there.
What was, like, I'm just curious, because I've seen the Blues Brothers. I went to Chicago, and I went outside with my girlfriend at the time. I didn't even think about any of the crime and stuff. I just made a beeline for chess. It was like, I wasn't as impressed as Sun Records because they weren't as enthusiastic about it. But I didn't even think twice about being in South Side. Now I know a lot more about the South Side. What was Maxwell Street like then? Was it like a Beale or a Broadway, or just much more low-key?
No, it was like there was some old tenement buildings, and there was just like kind of empty lots, like dirt lots, covered in like garbage, and people would bring out like sawhorses and plywood, and they would sell things. And if you got there like 4 o'clock in the morning, you could find really good, mostly stolen things to buy, like whatever those things were, cameras or tools or instruments or anything you could name, you could find it there for sale. And the musicians would start coming to set up to play probably around early in the morning, 7, 8 o'clock. You'd have usually some kind of gospel music. A lot of times it would be a family, like a mother playing bass, a father playing guitar, some little kid on the drums, some other little kid singing backup vocals, playing tambourine.
So was it like more like affinity to churches and maybe trying to draw people into the respective church? Was it like that, or just purely entertainment?
These are people playing for money on the street. And then you'd have some blues musicians playing out there, playing for money. I think you could pay somebody in an apartment to throw you down a chord for $5 or $10 if you wanted to plug in. I think that was how they used to do it. And if you wanted to buy liquor because this only happened on Sunday. This was Sunday morning, and it would go until whenever it ended. And it was illegal to buy liquor before noon in those days. So it was kind of like a drug deal, trying to buy a pint of wine. You'd ask somebody where they got the pint of wine. They'd kind of like, "Hey, come over here. All right, you gotta go down and talk to the parking man in the parking lot, and then he'll tell you what to do." So you go down, you talk to him. All right, come here. You gotta go around the corner and knock on the paint store 3 times and ask for Jose. All right, you go over there, and then Jose, and then you pay like twice the price of what a pint of wine normally costs from a bootlegger.
Just because it's Sunday.
It was so ridiculous. Or sometimes people would sell a can of beer, and they'd have it wrapped up in a newspaper and sell a can of beer for $1 out of the back of a truck someplace like that.
That's kind of fun, though, like people making money and DIY. I like it. But that's cool.
And there was a lot of Latino people, a lot of Mexicans. There's a huge Mexican population in Chicago. And Maxwell Street became more and more Mexican and Central American as time went on. It had been a very, black African-American situation. That neighborhood, it was European immigrants, then it was Jewish immigrants, then it was black, then and now it's the University of Illinois at Chicago and its students, and it's all, like totally gentrified.
Right, Maxwell Street.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's
been
a safe part of the South.
Well, it's not really the South Side. It is technically, because it's
closer to the, I guess, the middle, right?
Yeah, it's close to the middle, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. You know what? I never ever met anyone that talked about Maxwell Street. I love streets, right? We're on Jefferson Street. It's a very famous Nashville street. Don't even get me started about Jefferson Street, but Beale Street, Broadway. These places are pretty important. Maxwell Street is important, but maybe to the point you'd have to be kind of almost really geeky into the blues to know about Maxwell Street.
It was like a giant flea market.
Okay.
It wasn't a place that had nightclubs and stuff like that at all. It was like a giant flea market, and it happened on Sundays. And it probably happened like during the week at some point in time, but in my time it happened on Sundays.
Yeah, very cool. And so when you were talking to these blues artists that your influences, you just kind of, would you watch them, observe them, or like you'd go, hey, how did you do that lick, or what scale were you playing in, or, and probably they didn't know, right? Because most of these guys don't. It's just a feeling. They don't like learn classically. You can't really ask them, you know. I don't know. I don't even know if they know that what the blues note is or the fifth. You know, like.
I didn't know, and I don't think I would have known to ask any of those questions. I think what it normally was like would be, I would grab some liquor and maybe some food, and I would go over to these projects at Madison and Ashland, and I would go over and knock on Maxwell Street Jimmy's door, and I would say, hey, man, and he would say, who's there? And I'd say, it's Jake. Who's me? I'm like, it's Jake. Me who? It's Jake. And then he would open the door, and he would go, oh, it's Ray. He called me Ray for years. At first I was Hey Boy, and then I was Ray, and then I finally became Jake. I graduated to Jake after about 4 or 5 years. And then one...
It's like a karate.
It was,
you know, like it's like your black belt when they call you by your own name.
But I would go over to his house, and I really loved this guy. He was an alcoholic, and he didn't get taken so seriously by people. But he was like... He was a really a beautiful person, and he was a really interesting character, and he was a clown. But he wasn't just a clown in the sense of being a goofy guy. He had literally been, in the Rabbitfoot Minstrels, had been like a clown when he was a teenager. Wow. He ran away with the Rabbitfoot Minstrels when he was like 13 or 14, late 30s. He danced on broken glass in a grass skirt. And he learned how to play guitar later. He learned from John Lee Hooker, who was like one of his best friends. They had a gospel quartet together at one time.
He's lucky because from what I've heard of John Lee Hooker, he's very private about his guitar style. Very kind of doesn't want to explain it. Never told the backing band too much. You know, they had to just kind of fall in with him and stuff. And he didn't like answering questions around technique, you know.
I think they were just buddies. They just hung out together. And so his style of playing, because they would have known each other when they were teenagers or early 20s or something, before John Lee Hooker moved to Detroit from Mississippi. And then he followed him to Detroit at some point and played some club dates with him, and eventually moved down to Chicago and started playing on Maxwell Street. So a typical day would be going to his place, bring over some booze, maybe bring over some food, hang out a little bit, talk some shit, hang out with the people in the yard out in front of the projects, other, you know, older people. Yeah. And then we'd hop in my car and we would like find some place we might be able to go make some money playing, you know. So wow. We would go to a bar and just ask if we could play for drinks. So we, you know, at some point we'd be out of money. We'd go play for drinks, or maybe we could see if we could play on the street someplace, make a few bucks or whatever. So we did that sometimes. Sometimes we just hang out. With Honeyboy, I would go to his house. Sometimes with my friend Rick Sherry, who was a harmonica player.
Honeyboy, oh my God! I was reading about him a little last night. I didn't realize he was the guy he was the guy that his story is now the belief story on the demise of Robert Johnson. Mm-hmm. You know, he was it's insane the group of people these guys kicked about with when they were kids in Mississippi. You know, like it just blows my mind.
Well, Honeyboy, he was as good as anybody. I mean, you can listen to these recordings of him from 1942, from the field recording guy, Library of Congress, Lomax. Yeah. Amazing. He was as good as anybody, blowing harmonica and playing guitar at the same time and singing his ass off, and he was great. Yeah, I believe him, and I'll tell you why. Because if you ever hear Honeyboy tell a story, which that's mostly what we did. That would be a typical day with Honeyboy, is you bring over some beer, maybe Rick brought weed, and you know, we would go and hang out with him, and he would tell stories, and then he would ask us to play guitar and play music for him. He would say, play me that record by Tommy Johnson or whatever, meaning play a song that he liked, and then he would sing, and then he'd play guitar, but mostly he would tell stories. And the thing about him telling stories that was amazing was that his stories weren't really centered around him. Mm-hmm. It was as if he just happened to be some percentage of the story. He just happened to be one element. And he would tell you this story that was so panoramic. Mm-hmm. you know, what this person's doing and what that person's doing. And a lot of times with the older people that I hung out with, their stories would be not just blues people, but in general, and people in general. You know, people like to talk about themselves. And he was not as much like that. He liked to tell stories, but it was so enriching. And he would make you feel like you were there with him. And you were a part of that. You know, he would actually take you into that world. And so his stories, they didn't have that sense of being hyped up in a certain way to promote something about him. You know, and so when he told something, it really had the sound and the feel of being very factual, actually.
That's really fascinating. So one part, so like I grew up with parents from Croatia, and they were like, you know, my parents lived on farms and had like, you know, from villages and stuff, and the parallels between villages in Croatia, and this would be anywhere in Europe and here, are just incredible. And also just the way the people I know from those times, like, so, and I miss these people terribly. Like when I grew up, there were these old people that could tell you these stories, and it's very similar to the story, how you're describing the storytelling. It's just that they came from a time without TV and maybe very bare minimum radio, and they had to entertain and fill the space in such a way, and it's a lost art, and it made them really rich people. Like, I really terribly miss these people. I miss the way their stories built community, just in the way they told them. They had time maybe to develop this. They had people around them, and I feel this when I go to Mississippi and I see these people. I love the ones that intermix stories, and they remind me of my youth and these people I know from villages too. It's the same. It's that, and it's just that you're experiencing that in Chicago, you know, and they came from villages in you know, Mississippi, really.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's and you know, you can see how music connected in other parts of the world, because they were drawing on similar experiences, like an experience of being poor in a village in Europe post World War II would be very similar to the experience of being poor. Not the same, but similar. There's like similarities in being poor in Tennessee or something. And so, you know, sometimes we forget. We kind of like go, oh, it was all going in here. That was it was like that. They're hillbillies over here, and that's what, you know. But it's a global story. Yeah. So even this thing is a kind of the way they tell stories. They, you know, the way they keep you engaged, and they want to tell stories. Like, you being part of that is you giving them the opportunity to tell the story and to build a community for them. There's like some self-serving thing to that too, right? I don't know. Anyway, that's just me.
Well, it's an interesting comparison, and to think about, you know, how different maybe it is now. And yet people have podcasts, and they're telling stories like you're drawing out right here.
Yeah, and we talked about why we do that a little the other day, about how sometimes I feel like I need to go to Clarksdale, Mississippi, in order for someone to ask me what's my story. You know, I need to be in the Delta, and I'll get someone that actually wants to know who I am and what my story is, you know. Maybe because of my sideburns or something, like, you know. And
I thought about that. I thought, what if we just did Frank's story here instead of me? I mean, you know, you're a guy who's lived all over the world, and you know, you seem to have a very interesting background, and you don't really talk much about yourself. Mm-hmm. Maybe you'll let me interview you.
Well, you know, I'd love to. Well, you do, like, because you're my meditation teacher. But the synergies with experiences, like, ultimately, when I'm listening to you talk about Maxwell Street. So my experience of living in London was that I would seek out old teddy boys, and I just absolutely adored their stories. People that were in whether they were, you know, there are some crazy people in the UK that are part of the history of American roots music and its revival. Like a guy called Brian Coffey, and he was one of the first guys in the UK in the 70s. There were bands like Crazy Cabin where they didn't even know that there was a double bass being played by those old rockabilly bands in Sun Records. They assumed it was a drum, and they replicated the slap bass on a drum. That's how little they knew in the early 70s, sorry. about America. And there was these pioneer characters who I got to meet. Like, I'm a bit like you. I like a good story, and I like to meet these people. And I think, to me, like I don't know, like Bear and Honey or something, I don't know. But I had 3 hours when I got to speak with Brian Coffey. I didn't even know who he was until afterwards. And someone was trying to tell me who he was whilst we were talking. And he happily shared all this information. And literally, this guy went from the UK, came down to Memphis, Tennessee, met Sam Phillips. Sam took him to some like warehouse where there was just 45s like scattered on the ground, and they would be walking over these 45s, like cracking them as they walk. These that are now worth, like a That's Alright Mum is worth like 5,000 USD, like an original printer or something to that effect, probably more. And he took them back to England. And then they released them on things like Charlie Records. They sped it up. Jungle Rock's a classic example. And they brought these hillbillies out of oblivion in the South. And they became television celebrities overnight. Jungle Rock, some 20 years afterwards. And it's just because this guy cared so much about music. Mm. And then these Teddy boys, like, I think people maybe don't understand. In England, you had 50s, and then the way subculture got represented was by these Teddy boys. They wore Edwardian drape jackets. That was what they wore, and they had ducktail hair, and they listened to Bill Haley in the Comets and things like that. Rock Around the Clock was huge, right? And then it became like a subculture of 50s. And they had a couple of waves. They had the 50s, and they had another resurgence in the 70s, and then in the 80s you had rockabillys, like purist rockabillys, and they'd go back to the original dress and dead stock and everything, and that became a massive scene, of which we have Viva Las Vegas. And
it seems like it's even bigger than ever right now.
It was maybe in the last 10 years, like in London and in Europe. It's not maybe as big as it was, but it's still big enough to have festivals where 3,000 people turn up. And I think you met. Who was it that you met recently? One of the promoters.
I'll be playing the Rockabilly Rave.
Right, that's one of them. 5,000. So that's great, and you'll see what it's like. I mean, these people. There's a couple of generations of people that have lived 50s music, and so there's something. So Brian Coffey and these people that instigated these revivals went to like Memphis off their own bat when Memphis was nothing. Like people moved on from rockabilly very quickly, and found this stuff and brought it back to the UK, and then they revived it. They reproduced it. They reprinted it and sent it out, and people were buying Sun Records 45s in 70s London, kids, in the second wave of the Teddy Boy revival. And I mean, Teddy Boys is like a podcast on its own, but I've met these people, and Brian Coffey I met a few years back, and to watch him dance at like one of these festivals, I saw him dance at Rhythm, right? There's a glint in their eyes, like they have found the elixir of life. And I've seen that in these old Teds. And it's funny, like, again, I came to Nashville because I was looking for something even more authentic. But I probably had pretty damn good authenticity in the UK, being with these people. And, and it sounds like you found the same, and you look for the same. It's just you looked for it in your neck of the woods, and it happened to be blues artists. And then
one thing about the British that I found out with American music is like they know more about it than we do. Mm-hmm. Kind of mind blowing. I mean, not more than everybody, but I walked into some place and they were playing this somewhat obscure soul singer named Howard Tate, and I'm a big Howard Tate fan. I went up to this guy like, "Wow, you're spinning Howard Tate. Like, how did you come to play Howard Tate?" And he just looked at me like, "What's your problem?" Like this is the ordinary music. This, like, soul music over there is also this
Northern
massive
soul.
thing.
Yeah.
It's almost like the national music of England.
Of the North.
Of the North?
Yeah, maybe.
More than the rest of England?
Yeah, it was a big Northern thing.
I went to some party. I don't know when this was. This is a long time ago. I went to some party down in a basement in London, and they were spinning nothing but 45 soul records.
Do you remember if it was in Soho? Was it like maybe Madame Jojo's or something like that?
I can't remember what it was. But it just seemed like, wow. And they had all this really obscure stuff, and it was great.
Oh, my God. Like, you talk about learning off blues artists, and I learnt off DJs. Like, I was trained by really I mean, there were magicians in spinning records. Magicians, like it's a fine art, and you know, it really is. You can tell how good someone can get if they get so caught up in that. And the Northern Soul movement was a DJ-driven movement. There wasn't bands. So that's how these people are creatures of the music. You know, it's an art in itself. So yeah, and probably the average person has a higher level of knowledge about the musical history behind their particular subculture than the average person here. Like, I'm not going to name any names, but I'm so impressed by how little people know about the history of the music they play. When I come across contemporary bands playing that music in Nashville, I almost have to like drag them to the archaeological sites and tell them you must go here and there to understand where this is. But in a way, I kind of appreciate it too, because my guitar teacher is Ronnie Croatia, and we talk about this with him. I talk about it a lot. I love the fact that he comes to conclusions about the music by actually being scientific about it. He doesn't read about it like I do and tell you the story. You know, he'll look at it objectively and see the connections between the way the scales are played and the notes between, say, bluegrass and this, and he'll say, well, this is how I can say that the blues was influenced by bluegrass or vice versa, and he'll talk it like a scientist, and I really appreciate that side of it too, because the stories can sometimes be stories, right? Like, so then, I mean, I imagine there was a lot of pressure on these blues artists in Chicago to all say they knew Robert Johnson. You know, like that. I could only imagine, like, a lot of people.
Well, he wasn't really a thing until, certainly people who had heard his records thought this is a guy who's a great player. Anybody who saw him play thought this is a guy who's a great player, certainly, anybody. But he wasn't this sort of big deal in a way until really some like white record executive guy kind of made it a big deal. I mean, he was definitely the hot shot. But like when I hear Honeyboy talk about him, it was like, hey, we're just kids playing music.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if like that was necessarily a thing for guys in the 50s who were, from Mississippi that were, played music. I mean, there were some guys that played like him. Like there was his stepson, Robert Jr. Lockwood, who really influenced the Chicago sound a lot.
Uh-huh. Yeah, the only reason I ask is Teddy Boys would never let the truth get in the way of a good story, and it was part of their thing to tell. They knew you wanted a story, so they would tell you a story. And in a way, I mean, truth versus the reality, I think, what do you want to hear? You want to hear about how he sold his soul or blah, 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 so I'll tell you about that, or, especially people like Son House, like I love listening to him talk and stuff. Like he's an actor, he's very theatrical, and that's part of the music. And so imagine some of it is that too, so I'd like to think that they were just kicking about together. That would be interesting, right? A lot of movements start from a core group of people that then go on to separate and start their own bands, right? Mm-hmm. You see that in subcultures everywhere. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure that's the case. But it also interests me because I also know the village storytelling mentality, you exaggerate too. Yeah. Like, so there's an element of where, you got to take it with a grain of salt. The Teds were really good at that too, When you talk to them, you have to be careful because the idea of hoodwinking you was like a little game they like to play too. So it's that's why they're lovable. They're lovable rogues. You know what I mean? Like it's a really weird subculture. It's really weird. It was very violent. It was very violence was a really big part of it. And I didn't grow up in a violent scene. Maybe you growing up in punk scene in Chicago was more violent. I seem to miss the violent episodes of subculture.
I didn't find that. The punk scene was really friendly in Chicago. It was a really small scene. I mean, when I was hanging out in that world, it was like 1982, 83, 84. Mm-hmm. And we didn't have all this sort of influence from L.A. yet, like the L.A. punk gang thing that happened a little later.
Never even heard of that.
Yeah, there was like the the Suicidal Tendencies kind of crew, and bands like that, and like the skinhead thing hadn't become this big violent scene yet. That came a little later, in the mid to late '80s, and by that point I wasn't really hanging around the punk scene anymore. So there was violence in the Chicago punk scene. It didn't show up until after I left, but in the early days, people would line up to catch you if you were stage diving. It was almost too cute in a way. It was a good place to be if you were a person that didn't fit in.
Right. Steve Albini talks about that. I think even Dave Grohl talks about Chicago punk scene, and it's for geeks and outsiders rather than,
really. Like I was into theater then. I was a drama major in a fine arts public high school in Chicago. And I thought I wanted to be an actor at that point. And I dropped out when I discovered punk rock. Basically, that was it. I got in the punk scene. I stopped going to high school.
Do it yourself. That kind of, why do I need someone to teach me? I just got to work my own way out,
I don't know if I thought into it that much. I just knew I couldn't really hang in school, and then drama sort of went by the wayside for 20-something years until it came back around, or whatever, 15 years till it came back around.
Jake, you got a crazy life like me, I think. You've seen a lot and done a lot of different things, and we could talk probably for hours about different angles to your life as well,
But we're going to have to wrap this up.
We will, I think, because it'll be very hard to upload this to YouTube.
Yeah. We could always do a part 2 somewhere down the road once
I think it's cool. Like I've had a lot of synergies with my own experience talking to you about your experience and that inquisitiveness that it's like literally a sound that makes you want to, I think it makes you want to travel to understand a little bit about how the person made the sound. And sometimes I get down on it and I go, why am I focusing on the architecture and the place? Maybe it's in the music, like my teacher. But I think talking to you, I realize that there's just so many parts of it, and I kind of slightly reaffirmed that it is important to kind of visit the place and to understand the context, and that there's a value to that.
So many different worlds you could enter into. That you walk into anybody's apartment or step into a conversation with anybody, it's like a whole nother world. Like each person in their life is a whole separate world, which I'm sure like when you're doing a podcast, you find that out. Mm-hmm. But in a town like this, really anywhere, you could do that. But I imagine, I don't get out of the house much, but I imagine that you could go to some different places and, really step into some different worlds here, some different communities. There's all these different immigrant communities here.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, totally.
Like the Kurdish community.
Right. Totally. I agree. Someone said that to me recently. You can pretty much find whatever you're looking for here. You just got to look. And it does take time to reorientate, to move the ship. Our ships don't move so easily, It takes a few months, a year maybe, and then you're in a different... We always assume I've got an idea and I'm going to act on it, but actually it takes a while to kind of move slowly like that.
Does it?
I think so. Yeah. But thank you, Jake La Botz. And
my pleasure.
Hope you're having a good time over there, Mike.
Yeah, very much. I love talking to you, Frank.
All right. Thank you.